Once we form the clusters, we can compare them to one another, both in terms of the variables that were used to create the clusters and also in terms of other variables. So for example, this graph shows the mean factor score for members of each cluster or segment on the different factors that were used to form the clusters in the first place. So for example, both of these segments, those who are shown in red and blue in our previous visualizations, um, they're all much more interested than members of the other clusters in home activities. Whereas if we look over here at those who were shown previously in purple, they're more interested in competitive sports than members of the other clusters or segments are. Um, and those shown over here, um, who were yellow in the previous diagram, are most interested in water sports. Members of this segment are not so interested in a number of activities, including competitive sports, water sports, and home activities. They're below average in all of those things. As I said, we can also compare the clusters or segments based on other variables that weren't used to create the clusters. So for example, we can look at what proportion of them, of the total number of visitors are in each of the clusters, and we can see that this is the biggest cluster, the one that we just talked about before that was below average on many of the variables. We can see that this was the smallest cluster, and we could see that before too, just in looking at which color was associated with what number of people. But we can also see, for example, the country of origin of the different members of the different clusters. So for example, of those in the red segment, 59% of them lived in New Zealand, which is not in and of itself that useful to know until you start comparing it to the other clusters, and we see that that's more than in any other cluster. And that compares, for example, to those in the green segment where only 31% of them live in New Zealand. Similarly with gender, we can see that 55% of those in the red group were female, which isn't that meaningful until we see, for example, that in the yellow group, 65% were female, so that's more than any of the other segments, whereas in the purple segment, only 11% are female. We can do a similar comparison in terms of age and find that those in the purple segment are the youngest, whereas people in the yellow segment are the oldest. We can compare them in terms of the number of birds seen. That's not radically different except for the purple that's higher at 18 than any of the other segments. And we can compare them in terms of length of stay, and the purple is also longest there. Based on these characteristics, both those that were used to form the clusters in the first place and additional comparisons like we've shown here, are often used to give the clusters a name that makes them easier to remember than something like just a number or a color. And so I've called those in this first grouping homebodies because they're very interested in home activities, but not a lot of other things. Where I've called the people that were in the blue segment city people because they like home activities, but they also like city culture. Those who were in the purple segment have been called competitors because they like competitive sports. And those in the yellow segment have been called seafarers because they're particularly partial to water sports. So that part is more art than science. We're just looking at the overall profile of the members of each segment and giving them a name based on that.